Hi there, my name's Jack and welcome to Noobminster, the Thinking Idiot's Guide to UK Politics. So, sort of the point of these videos is to try and explain in non-boring terms how British politics works. I'm not going to tell you what's right and what's wrong, I'm just going to be looking at the nuts and bolts. So, to do that, we're going to start by looking at the Constitution, because that really is the starting point from which everything else bolts on. We're probably going to do that over the course of 3 videos, but let's get it underway with just a real simple question about what is a constitution? What does it actually mean? And it's a pretty interesting area. If you ask an American what they think about their constitution, they're liable to get really, really enthused, because those guys love their constitution. They absolutely beam off it. However, if you ask a British person what they think of our constitution, the chances are they're going to glaze over and start scratching their head. And that's because the British constitution is a very, very weird beast. Let's have a look at why.
Blah, 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 blah. Noobminster. Have you ever seen a kid trying to deal with a board game they're just really not ready for? Like this 5-week-old baby trying to figure out Monopoly board. See, at first it's pretty cute, but it's not long before it all falls apart and you get hotels lodged into ear canals and houses up nostrils. And this is just one kid we're dealing with here. Once you get a bunch of them and you give them a Monopoly board, all hell breaks loose because they're suddenly making up rules and then they're breaking rules. Everything's very arbitrary, and before long you get chaos.
In short, it's not much fun, but it's also basically what a country looks like if it doesn't have a constitution. Except that in the case of a country, you'll find there's more genocide, roving banditry, and probably ethnic cleansing. From this point of view, a constitution's a really big deal because it's essentially a rule book. It's a rule book that shows us how a country is governed. So in that rule book, we tend to find things like who's in charge, how do they get to be in charge, what they can do, what they can't do, and how we can get rid of them as well. So that's all pretty simple, right? Well, the problem with constitutions is that there's a lot of different ways of doing it, and each country has their own specific take.
Let's stick with Monopoly for a second and pretend that 2 games are about to start. One in America and one in Britain. Now, for the Americans, setting up as a breeze. They open up the box, they retrieve the rulebook, and then they divvy up the money in the manner that the rulebook says. There might be a few minor quibbles about who gets to be banker or who gets to be the racing card, but if someone's not sure what they're supposed to be doing, they just look it up in the rulebook. It's pretty simple. In contrast, the Brits are having an absolutely torrid time getting the game off the ground. Mainly because instead of finding a tidy little rulebook inside the box, they discover thousands of tiny scraps of paper scattered all over the place, each one scrawled with a number of rules that were made up by the players of previous games by putting them to a vote. These represent what are known as statutes. They're essentially laws made by Parliament, and there are literally thousands of the buggers, all spilling out in no particular order. Worse still, some of them have been scribbled out as players have voted to scrap various laws over the years, so a good few hours are spent trying to sort out exactly what rules still apply and which ones don't. Oh, and on top of that, some international treaties also have the same impact on the Constitution, and European law complicates matters even further. However, that's only the start of the trouble, as it turns out that there's another box marked Common Law, and this is equally filled to the brim with similar scraps of paper that also have a bearing on the way that the game is played. The thing that makes them different from statutes, which are made by Parliament, is that these rules are the results of disputes that a judge has presided over. So, let's say that in a previous game an argument broke out over who gets custody of the old boot, and it was so intractable that the players had to call in the next door neighbour to make an impartial decision as to who gets the most rubbish piece. Once that decision is made, it becomes a template for how that dispute would be settled if it ever occurred again, and it's also another component that makes up the British Constitution. Anyway, another hour goes down the pan, but the group seem to be getting on top of the legal situation. That is until the host says, "I assume we're putting all our fines in the middle, and whoever lands on free parking gets to keep them all, right?" At this point, another player pipes up and demands to know why we would do that when there's been absolutely no mention of the free parking rule in either statute or common law. "Because that's just how we do it here," replies the host, and the rest of the room nod along in agreement.
This is what's known as a convention. Now, conventions are probably the most vexing aspect of an already pretty bonkers and out there constitutional system. So what are they? Well, basically they're promises, but they're promises that aren't written down. So a good example of a convention is what happens after a general election. By convention, the Queen is supposed to invite the person most likely to command the confidence of the House of Commons to form a government. Now, let's say you've had an election where there's been a very clear result, where one party has been returned with a majority of MPs. This is a pretty straightforward choice then. The Queen approaches the member of the largest party and asks them to form a government. However, sometimes you get something called a hung parliament. This is where no single party has a majority. In that case, the convention becomes tantalisingly vague. After all, who do you approach if no one's won outright? In practice, what happens is that the Queen consults with high-ranking civil servants and constitutional experts. But still, they seem to be a very wobbly plank in our constitutional setup. And on top of that, there's no real punishment. If you do break a convention, no one knows what really happens. All we know is that it's not a good thing to break a convention.
Anyway, the uppity player is silenced by the nodding of his peers. That's how we get things done in the UK. We silently nod all opposition into the ground. And the first roll of the dice is about to happen when another player comes in clutching a book called The Expert's Guide to Monopoly. Hold on, they say. This book mentions that some people play a rule that you get £400 when you're landing on go. Can we do this?
What they've done here is invoke a work of authority, and this is the final source of the British Constitution. So put simply, there are a number of very old and very wordy books, such as Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, that are deemed to be works of authority. And what they're used for is to interpret the Constitution. So they don't actually make any laws or anything like that. But let's say you have a situation where you've been looking through all the statutes, been looking through all the common law precedents, and for this situation there doesn't seem to be a clear-cut answer. At that point, you might be able to fall back on a work of authority to provide an interpretation of that situation. Quite, though, how a book becomes a work of authority is, just like pretty much everything else in British politics, as clear as mud.
Back to the game, and as it happens, the group appear to be the sort of joy-killing squares who always scuff at my attempts to instigate the £400 rule every Christmas, so the matter is dropped, and the Brits finally get round to the first roll of the dice. 5 hours after the Americans have finished up and gone to bed.
Despite this, though, they have provided a pretty good breakdown on what our Constitution is based on. So, just to recap, well, the American Constitution consists of one unifying text, so one body of work where all the rules are written down that you can actually see, you can actually touch it. The British Constitution is different. It's comprised of several different elements, some of which exist only on a weird metaphysical level. So, these are statutes, which are laws that are passed by Parliament, but also include things like treaties, and to a horribly complicated extent, European law. Then we've got common law. This is basically the notion of how we've done things in the past. Then there's conventions. Those are those tricky little promises that aren't written down anywhere, but are considered to be binding. And finally, we have works of authority. These are the worthy old tomes that are deemed to be authoritative sources on the Constitution. Okay, so that pretty much sums up where our Constitution comes from. It's also worth pointing out as well that there are plenty of other systems out there, plenty of other ways of doing it, some which are crazy, some which are quite sensible. If you've taken anything away from the above, I imagine it will be something along the lines of, oh my God, what are we doing? This is madness, I tell you. And I sympathise, I really do, because it does appear to be a very cack-handed way of governing a country. However, there is some divine method behind the madness, and over the next 2 videos, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how actually some of this makes a lot of counterintuitive sense. So, please do come back. I'm sure I'm supposed to say something about subscribing or something like that. I don't know. Maybe I'll put a nice little caption on the bottom. We'll see. But come back for the next video. And yeah, this has been me, Jack at Noobminster. Thank you very much.